A bustling library, sunlight streaming through tall windows, the faint murmur of visitors flipping pages and soft footsteps echoing across polished floors. Narration. It was a busy afternoon, the kind of day where every corner of the library seemed alive with whispers, the soft shuffle of books, and the occasional cough. Students hunched over their desks. Visitors wandered between shelves. And then he walked in. The young librarian noticed him immediately. He didn't rush. He didn't fidget. He just walked with a calm, measured pace, his eyes scanning the room, not impatient, but aware. She laughed under her breath. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. A few nearby staff glanced over, curious. "You expect me to believe this guy belongs here," she said aloud, louder this time. "Look at him, he's old, quiet, and he probably hasn't touched a book in decades." A ripple of nervous laughter spread across the staff and a couple of visitors. Some smirked politely, others exchanged uneasy glances. The air seemed light, until it wasn't. The man didn't flinch. He didn't react to the laughter, the smirks, or the whispered judgments. He stood there, calm, almost untouchable. There was a stillness about him that didn't belong in a busy library, a quiet confidence that made people instinctively step back, even without realizing it. A senior staff member, who had been shelving books nearby, noticed him instantly. Something about the way he carried himself, the way he looked around without a trace of arrogance, made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She whispered to a colleague, "Do you see him? There's something different about him. He's not just a visitor." Meanwhile, the young librarian, fueled by arrogance and the need to prove control, took a step closer. "People like you shouldn't be here," she said, smirking. "You probably think libraries are like action movies, huh?" The man didn't move. He didn't react. He simply folded his hands in front of him and waited. And for a moment, the bustling library seemed to pause. Then, without warning, the main doors swung open. The library director stepped inside, scanning the room. The moment his eyes met the man standing quietly among the shelves, the entire room went silent. Even the whispers stopped. Everyone sensed it, the air had changed. Something extraordinary was happening, and no one yet understood it. The library was alive with quiet activity. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden patterns across the polished wooden floors. Shelves towered over visitors, each one filled with books that seemed to whisper stories of 1,000 worlds. Yet, in the midst of this calm, tension was building in one corner. The young librarian, still bristling from the earlier encounter, paced near the entrance. She was used to being in control here, to having every visitor follow her subtle rules. But the man standing in the middle of the room didn't seem to notice her authority, or care. He didn't fidget. He didn't glance around nervously. He simply observed, quietly taking in the layout, the people, the smallest details of the environment. A senior staff member, an experienced librarian with decades in the profession, had been shelving books nearby. She couldn't take her eyes off him. There was a precision in the way he moved, subtle and deliberate. Every glance, every shift of weight, every pause was measured. He was quiet, yes, but it wasn't mere silence. It was an almost imperceptible power, the kind that made someone feel watched even when the person appeared calm. The young librarian approached him cautiously, her steps firm but slightly shaky under the weight of her own pride. "I hope you realize this is a public space," she said, forcing a confident smile. "We have rules here, and people like you, well, you don't usually follow them." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning the books, the staff, the visitors. His calm presence seemed to stretch across the room, slowing the pace of everyone's heartbeats. Even the chatter of visitors seemed to quiet down without anyone realizing it. The senior staff member whispered to a colleague, her voice low and tense. "There's something different about him. I can't explain it, but he's not ordinary. He moves like he knows exactly what's going to happen next." Meanwhile, the young librarian tried again, this time with a sharper tone. "Do you even read books? Or are you just wandering around pretending you belong?" A few nearby visitors turned to watch, sensing the brewing tension. Some were curious, some uneasy, and some clearly intimidated by the quiet confidence radiating from the man. He didn't answer. He just shifted his weight, adjusted his posture slightly, and continued to observe. The senior staff member leaned closer to the colleague beside her. "Watch him. Every move he makes matters. He's testing the room, but I can't tell what he's planning." The young librarian felt a pang of frustration. She had confronted people before, but there was something about this man that made her words feel small, almost meaningless. Her smirk faded as she realized that her usual tactics weren't working. He didn't react the way anyone else would. And then, without any warning, the library seemed to hold its breath. Something was about to happen, and everyone could feel it, even if they didn't know why. Have you ever felt completely unprepared for someone who seems calm but dangerous? Type "calm power" in the comments if you've witnessed this kind of presence. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. The young librarian's frustration had reached its peak. She had tried subtlety, she had tried authority, and yet the quiet man standing in the middle of the library didn't budge. He didn't flinch. He didn't even glance at her when she spoke. That infuriated her more than anything. She took a step closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice sharper now, forcing a note of authority. "This is a place of order. People like you don't just stroll in and act like you belong. You're going to follow the rules, or you're going to leave." A few visitors glanced over nervously. They sensed the tension, the strange imbalance in the room. On one side, a young woman trying to assert control. On the other, a quiet older man whose very presence made her words feel small. He didn't respond. Not immediately. Instead, he folded his hands calmly in front of him, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. His eyes, though, betrayed nothing but observation, calculating, steady, almost unreadable. The librarian's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of impatience. She leaned in slightly, trying to intimidate. "People like you watch too many action movies, don't you?" she said, her tone mocking. "You think you're in some big Hollywood adventure, but this is real life. Real rules. And you're not special." Still, he didn't react. He didn't snap. He didn't defend himself. He just waited. The calmness he radiated was unnerving. It made her words feel hollow, almost absurd. And that unnerved her even more. A senior staff member, observing from the corner, whispered to a colleague. "She's going too far. That man, he's not like anyone we've seen. Watch closely. His calm isn't weakness, it's something else entirely." The librarian's face turned red. She could feel her control slipping, and panic began to mingle with her frustration. "Do you even know how to behave in a place like this?" she snapped. "I could ask you to leave right now." Finally, the man spoke, his voice quiet but deliberate. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to observe." There was no arrogance, no condescension, just calm, measured words. But the librarian couldn't take it anymore. Her hands clenched into fists, and she leaned even closer, trying to dominate the space. "Observe? You think you can just waltz in here and act like nothing matters? You're not in charge here. You're nothing special." The entire library seemed to pause. Visitors froze mid-step. Staff held their breaths. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows felt sharper, colder, as if the room itself was holding judgment. The man shifted his weight slightly, still folded his hands, still calm. And for a moment, time seemed to slow. Every heartbeat, every whisper, every step felt amplified. The senior staff member's voice was barely audible, almost a warning. "This isn't over. She has no idea who she's provoking." And just as the librarian prepared to take another step, to push her authority further, the main doors opened. Everyone in the room instinctively turned. The library director had arrived. The tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. The librarian froze mid-sentence, her arrogance colliding with the reality of what, or who, she was dealing with. The library seemed quieter now, though the chatter of visitors hadn't completely stopped. Every subtle movement in the room felt magnified, every rustle of paper like a drumbeat. The young librarian had stepped back slightly, though her pride made it impossible to admit defeat. She kept glancing at the man, trying to read him, trying to find a crack in his calm exterior. But there was nothing. Not a flinch, not a reaction, Nothing. Meanwhile, the senior staff member continued to observe him from the corner. Her experienced eyes picked up details others would have missed. The man wasn't just standing there. He was analyzing. He knew the layout perfectly, subtly shifting his weight to see every angle of the room. His gaze followed each staff member's movement, anticipating their next steps. It wasn't just observation, it was strategic, calculated, controlled. One of the younger staff whispered to the senior librarian, barely audible, "Who is he? How does he know this place so well?" The senior staff member shook her head slightly. "I don't know, but something about him isn't ordinary. He moves with purpose, even when he appears to do nothing. Watch him carefully." The young librarian, sensing that the room's attention was beginning to drift from her, tried to regain control. She stepped forward again, this time less smug and more cautious. "Do you know how this place works?" she asked sharply. "Every corner, every hallway, there are rules. Cameras. Security. And you act like you don't even notice them." He turned his gaze toward her for a fraction of a second, just enough to respond without giving away anything. "I notice," he said calmly. "I always notice." That brief exchange made a few staff members exchange uneasy glances. Something about the way he said it, so simple, so calm, carried weight. It was as though he wasn't just observing. He was aware of everything that was about to happen before it even occurred. The librarian tried again, her voice shaking slightly now with frustration. "You really think you can just walk in here and act like you belong? People like you." A subtle shift in the man's posture made her pause. His eyes flicked toward a corner of the library where no one had thought to check the cameras. He knew exactly what was there. "How did you know that hallway doesn't have cameras?" one visitor whispered, astonished. "Experience," the man replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. At that moment, a few staff members began to feel uneasy. The confident arrogance of the librarian, which had dominated the room for the last several minutes, seemed to falter in his presence. Even visitors who had been quietly watching sensed something powerful emanating from him. There was an invisible aura, a weight to his calm, that made the air itself feel charged. The senior staff member leaned closer to a colleague and murmured, "I'm telling you, there's more to him than we realize. Watch every movement. Listen to every word. He's testing the room, but I can't tell exactly why." Even the young librarian, pride wounded and frustration mounting, began to feel a subtle shift. She realized, deep down, that her usual tactics wouldn't work. She wasn't dealing with an ordinary visitor. The man remained calm, his presence like a silent storm gathering strength. Every second that passed reinforced a growing suspicion in the staff members' minds. This wasn't just any visitor. He had purpose, precision, and a depth of knowledge that made the entire room tense. And then, as if on cue, the main doors swung open once more. The library director had arrived. The tension in the room snapped, thick and electric. Every head turned, every eye fixed on the quiet man. The young librarian froze, unsure whether to continue asserting authority or step back entirely. The senior staff member whispered again, barely audible, "Prepare yourself. This is about to get very interesting." The doors at the far end of the library swung open with a definitive click, drawing every eye in the room. A hush fell immediately, almost instinctive, as if the air itself recognized authority. The library director stepped in, his posture straight, eyes scanning the space with a practiced precision that came from years of managing not just books, but people and crises alike. The young librarian's heart skipped a beat. She had been trying to maintain control, to assert her authority over someone she believed was a mere visitor. But the instant the director entered, she felt her words falter. He didn't need to raise his voice or gesture. His presence alone commanded attention. Every staff member, every visitor, straightened slightly, sensing that the room had changed. She hurried forward, desperation creeping into her tone. "Director! This man, he doesn't belong here. He's causing a scene, and I think he's trying to." The director raised a hand, a calm but unmistakable signal to pause. His eyes flicked to the man standing quietly among the shelves. And then something happened. Something subtle, but undeniable. His expression shifted instantly. His normally composed face tightened ever so slightly, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The room seemed to shrink. Even the faint hum of activity faded. Visitors who had been quietly watching now froze mid-step, mid-whisper. The young librarian's words stumbled and died on her lips as the director's gaze held the quiet man like a spotlight, exposing every detail of the scene. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" the director said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority that silenced the entire room. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. Respect. A mix of both, barely restrained. The young librarian's smirk faded completely. Her confidence, which had driven her to confront him earlier, crumbled under the weight of this new presence. She could feel it now. The quiet man wasn't ordinary. Not in the slightest. Meanwhile, the senior staff member in the corner took a small step forward, whispering to a colleague. "I told you. Watch closely. This is who I suspected. He's not just anyone." The quiet man remained still, folding his hands calmly. There was no show of power, no theatrics. But in that silence, in that simple posture, there was a palpable authority. Every staff member who had doubted him, every visitor who had underestimated him, felt it. It was invisible yet undeniable, like the calm before a storm that everyone instinctively feared. The director walked slowly toward him, each step deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath with every footfall. The young librarian took a hesitant step back, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. Even her hands trembled slightly, betraying the composure she had tried so hard to maintain. When the director finally stopped a few feet away, he studied the man carefully. Recognition hardened his features, and he let out a quiet, almost inaudible sigh. Then, in a tone that carried authority and awe in equal measure, he addressed the room. "This man," he said slowly, making sure every word landed, "is someone we should all respect. He is not just a visitor. He is someone whose experience and knowledge surpasses what any of us here could imagine." A few staff members exchanged glances, their unease turning into astonishment. The young librarian's jaw dropped slightly as reality sank in. She had underestimated someone who didn't just belong in this space. He commanded it, in a way she could barely comprehend. The quiet man said nothing, still calm, still composed. And yet, in the room's sudden silence, his presence spoke louder than any words ever could. Have you ever been in a room where one person's presence completely changed everything? Type, "respect the calm," in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. The library had gone completely silent. Every visitor, every staff member, even the young librarian herself, felt as if time had slowed. The quiet man stood there, calm, folding his hands in front of him, unassuming yet commanding. And yet, beneath that stillness, an unmistakable aura of authority radiated, an aura that made even the most confident feel small. The library director took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the man before him. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, as though the space itself had become a stage, and everyone present were mere witnesses to what was about to unfold. The visitors instinctively stepped back, sensing something monumental was happening. The young librarian remained frozen, unable to speak, her mind racing to comprehend what she was seeing. "This man," the director began, his voice calm but firm, carrying a weight that silenced every whisper, "is not just a visitor. He is not just an ordinary person wandering into a library." He paused, letting the words settle over the room, allowing the tension to build, thick and almost suffocating. A few staff members exchanged glances. The senior librarian in the corner narrowed her eyes, leaning closer to her colleague. "I knew it," she whispered. "I told you there was something extraordinary about him." The director continued, his tone measured, deliberate. "He has trained elite security personnel, not just for the city, but for major institutions across the country. Tactical units, law enforcement teams, specialized divisions. He has personally instructed, guided, and prepared them for situations far more dangerous than anything we've ever faced in a library." The young librarian's face drained of color. She had confronted him with arrogance and pride, assuming he was nothing more than an ordinary visitor. Now, the truth crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She swallowed hard, unable to find words, as the realization hit. She had underestimated someone whose experience and authority dwarfed her own knowledge tenfold. The director leaned closer to the man, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, as if sharing a personal acknowledgement meant only for him. "I've seen your work firsthand. You've trained teams that protect everything from government facilities to private institutions. Including this library. Including me. The quiet man inclined his head slightly, a simple gesture of acknowledgement, humble yet dignified. There was no pride, no boastful display, only calm. It was that calm, the kind that comes from mastery, experience, and true authority, that left the room in awe. The young librarian lowered her eyes, shame replacing frustration. Every word she had spoken earlier, every attempt to assert dominance, felt meaningless now. She had tried to challenge someone she didn't even begin to understand. And now she realized her mistake. Loud, arrogant words could never match quiet, measured expertise. Visitors and staff alike felt the weight of the moment. The quiet man's presence had shifted the energy of the entire room. Where arrogance once dominated, respect now ruled. Where doubt had existed, awe now filled every corner. The director stepped back slightly, addressing the entire room this time. "This man," he said, gesturing subtly, "is someone we should all respect. He carries knowledge and experience that few of us could ever hope to achieve. He is a teacher, a guide, a strategist. Someone whose calm presence alone can command respect and ensure safety." The librarian's voice was barely audible, almost lost to the room. I didn't realize." The quiet man smiled faintly, not in mockery, but in understanding. He did not insult her. He did not scold. He simply nodded once and continued to stand, embodying the calm authority that had left the entire library in stunned silence. The director watched him for a long moment, then addressed everyone in the room. "Let this be a lesson to all of us. Sometimes, the most powerful, the most capable people are not the loudest, the most aggressive, or the most obvious. Sometimes, their strength is quiet. And often, it's underestimated." The librarian nodded slowly, still processing the enormity of the revelation. She had learned something far more valuable than rules or procedures. She had learned about respect, humility, and the quiet power that commands it without raising a voice. Even as the quiet man prepared to leave, the room seemed to hold onto every step he took. His presence had transformed the space, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. The quiet man stood in the middle of the library for a long moment, his posture straight, his expression calm, his hands folded. The tension that had filled the room seemed to dissipate slowly, replaced by a profound sense of respect. Every person in the library, staff, visitors, and even the young librarian, felt it. His presence, once underestimated, now carried an invisible weight that settled over the room like a soft, commanding shadow. The young librarian, whose arrogance had sparked the confrontation, now felt an unfamiliar sensation, humility. She lowered her eyes, shame creeping over her like a tide. Every word she had spoken earlier, the mocking remarks, the insults, the attempts to assert authority, now seemed childish, insignificant, and misguided. She had underestimated someone whose experience, skill, and calm authority far exceeded anything she had imagined. The library director watched the scene carefully, noting the subtle shift in energy. He approached the quiet man, his voice gentle but firm. "Thank you for coming today," he said, a hint of admiration in his tone. "Not just for being here, but for reminding all of us of something we often forget." The quiet man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the words with a subtle nod. There was no need for grand gestures or proclamations. His calm demeanor alone communicated what no words could, that true power, mastery, and respect often come quietly, without arrogance, without noise, without the need for anyone else to notice. The young librarian's voice was barely audible, trembling with a mix of embarrassment and awe. I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "I misjudged you. The man shook his head slightly, a faint, understanding smile crossing his lips. He did not mock her. He did not insult her. He simply stood there, demonstrating that humility and calmness carried more weight than any angry words ever could. His silence was a lesson in itself, a lesson that spoke louder than any correction or reprimand. The library director looked around the room, his voice carrying a quiet authority that drew every attention. "Let this moment remind us all," he said slowly, ensuring every word landed with precision, "that the most powerful, the most capable people in a room are not always the loudest. Not always the ones who demand attention or assert control. Sometimes, the most dangerous or most skilled are those who remain quiet, who observe, and who act only when necessary. Visitors who had been watching in stunned silence now began to murmur among themselves, some nodding, some still processing what had occurred. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. Where there had once been arrogance, doubt, or misunderstanding, there was now clarity, respect, and awe. Even those who had not directly witnessed the confrontation sensed the weight of what had just transpired. The quiet man finally took a step toward the door. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, yet every step carried authority. The library director followed him with his eyes, not interrupting, allowing the man the dignity of leaving on his own terms. The young librarian, still humbled, watched as someone she had underestimated exited the space with nothing more than a nod and an aura of quiet mastery. As the door closed behind him, the library director spoke softly, almost to himself, though the words carried to everyone present. Remember this lesson. The most powerful, the most dangerous people in the room are often the quietest. The young librarian took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the lesson sink in. She had learned something far more valuable than any procedural rule, than any book on library management or discipline. She had learned about humility, respect, and the silent power that comes from mastery and experience. Staff members returned to their duties, but their movements were more deliberate now, their interactions tinged with a newfound awareness. Visitors resumed their browsing, but the memory of the quiet man's presence lingered, almost tangible, a reminder of a moment none of them would forget. The library director returned to his desk, glancing once more at the shelves, as if the quiet man's presence had permanently altered the energy of the space. The young librarian finally lifted her gaze, eyes meeting the director's. He nodded subtly, silently affirming that she had learned the lesson, one that would stay with her far longer than any reprimand or correction ever could. The quiet man's impact would remain, not in words, not in announcements, but in the invisible shift he had left behind, a demonstration that calmness, patience, and quiet confidence can command more respect than arrogance, aggression, or noise. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Power is often quiet, and respect is earned silently. The library returned to its usual rhythm, yet the story of that afternoon would echo for a long time in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The young librarian would never forget. Neither would the staff. And the visitors, those lucky enough to be present, would carry the lesson with them, that sometimes the quietest person in the room teaches the loudest lesson. If you respect people who stay calm under pressure, type "respect" in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from.